Performers who fear having the limelight stolen are advised never to work with children or animals. I would add, from personal experience, Russell Hoban. He was the most gracious and most proficient scene stealer I think I have ever met. In the early 80s, I was working on the committee of a science fiction convention to be called Mexicon. We wanted it to be different from the usual SF convention, more literary perhaps. So when we got to thinking about who we would like as guests, we automatically started thinking of people who weren't the usual science fiction writers, but whose work displayed something of the SF ethos. Someone suggested Alistair Gray, whose first novel Lanark had appeared just a year or two before. Then, on the strength of having read Riddley Walker when it first came out, I added the name Russell Hoban. And that was it. With those two names in the frame, I don't think we even considered anyone else. Anyway, I wrote to Hoban to invite him to the convention and to say that I would like to interview him as part of the programme. I got a letter back. Yes, I'd love to come to the convention. Why don't you come and have lunch so we can talk over the interview? Which is how I found myself on a District Line train where it runs overground heading south towards the river. He lived in a big old house with a view of the trains. I've re-encountered that house many times since because it reappears in quite a lot of his novels. I had no sooner knocked on the door than he swept me into what, in any other house, would have been the lounge. "Come and see where I work," he said. It was, I think, a large room, but that wasn't immediately obvious. I was in what appeared to be a narrow corridor, lined by bookshelves, bits of shortwave radio, and what was probably a flat surface if you could excavate under the piles of books and papers. This was his desk. He worked here, writing into the early hours of the morning while listening to radio stations from around the world. We shimmied around the freestanding shelves and found ourselves in the rest of the room. There were a couple of chairs, though I'm not sure they were ever used since they had things piled on them. There were shelves everywhere, books, papers, unexplained objects, and sources of music, radios, record players, tape decks, accompanied by the inevitable and disordered mountains of tapes and LPs. But the middle of the wooden floor was bare. Hoban described how, when he was working on a book, he would lay the pages out across the floor in lines. Then, as he told me, he would run up and down the lines of typescript to check the rhythm of the work. His books are mostly composed of short chapters, so I assume he was making sure that there weren't too many pages of solid text. But that's only a guess. He never did explain precisely what he meant by the rhythm of the work. However, every time I start to read one of his novels now, I have this inescapable vision of a little round jovial man running up and down a line of pages in that cluttered brown room. After this little tour, which was by turns intriguing, shocking and delightful, we went downstairs to a bright, spacious, modern kitchen that seemed to belong in a totally different house. Here we had lunch with his wife and talked for a long time. In among all of that, we covered the sorts of things I wanted us to discuss during the interview. Or so I thought. Flash forward however many months to Mexicon itself. The convention is going well, and Alistair Gray and Russell Hoban, in their very different ways, have proved to be excellent and very popular guests. And it's time for the interview. Now, I had conducted a couple of postal interviews before this, but never a face-to-face interview, and never one in front of an audience. I was nervous. I had spent ages preparing as thoroughly as I could. I had reread all of his 4 novels to date: The Lion of Boaz Jachin and Jachin Boaz, Kleinsight, Turtle Diary, and, of course, Riddley Walker. I think Pilgerman may have appeared by this time, but I'm not sure. and I had carefully crafted a series of questions laid out in my notebook in a logical order. I thought I was ready. We take the stage, introductions are made, I take a deep breath and begin. Shall we start by talking about your first novel, The Lion of Boaz Jachin and Jachin Boaz? I say, or something like that. Oh no, he replies. What was really my first novel was The Mouse and His Child. And he reaches into his bag and produces the clockwork figures of the mouse and its child that had inspired the book. And for the first half hour of our 1 hour interview, he talks about a book I had not at that point read, while manoeuvring the mouse figures around the table in front of him. The audience is enchanted, and I am feeling somewhat redundant. 5 minutes in, I quietly close up my notebook and put it away, because any plan I might have had for this interview has been comprehensively blown out of the water. Even when the interview gets back onto the books I have read, he doesn't stop scene stealing. When we finally get around to talking about Ridley Walker, he reaches into his bag once more and produces the rather battered head of Mr. Punch. I think back to all the diverse objects scattered around that workroom of his, and it is clear that there is some totemic object that is associated with, perhaps even inspires, each one of his books. The interview was a great success, though that was nothing whatsoever to do with me. Whenever I conducted an interview after that, I would never prepare anything other than the very first question. As for Russell Hoban, he went back to that overcrowded room with his shortwave radios, and in those circumstances, how could the novels he wrote have been anything other than eccentric?